old diver move. I need to make a small adjustment, hand me an 8-pound sledgehammer. Alright, so, good afternoon. My name is Master Diver Tomlin. A little bit of background about myself. I have a Bachelor of Science in Management and Information Systems, a Master of Science in Homeland Security and Emergency Management, and I'm currently working on my doctorate in Strategic Security. I've been a diver for 12 years. Have 2 tours to Iraq. My second tour, I was the liaison officer for all diving operations for U.S. Forces Iraq. So I've got a pretty good amount of experience downrange and in the Middle East. Currently the JDO course manager, the Joint Diving Officer Program, which you guys haven't had a lot of experience with them, but prior to the JDO course existing, they were actually embedded in the course with y'all for 2 chucks. So they do very similar stuff and they learn some more advanced topics before they graduate and get their diving officer pin. A quick disclaimer, some of the images in this presentation you may find disturbing. You should find them disturbing, all right? The fact of the matter is that we're in the business of war. War is never pretty, it never smells good, right? It's never any fun. But it is what we've signed up to do for a living. So we're going over the victim identity model. It's basically the method that I've developed to predict when the next violent outbreak will occur. Okay, and we'll get into detail on it as we go. If you have any questions, just go ahead and save them for the end and we'll have a little discussion at the tail end of the brief today. A gentleman by the name of Hedges is a Pulitzer-winning author, wrote a book called What Every Person Should Know About War. During his research, he discovered that war, defined as a conflict that takes 1,000 lives or more, of the past 3,400 years of recorded history, humans have been entirely at peace for only 268 of them, or just 8% of recorded history. Over 108 million people have died in just the 20th century during war. So it kind of begs the question, when you think about it, especially for that length of time, right? Why is it that we fight each other? Why do we kill each other? And when we do get into a warfare situation, why are we the good guys and the other person is the bad guys, right? They're the bad ones, they're the evil ones, and on their side of the coin, they're saying the same things about us, right? During World War II, the Japanese convinced their population that we were going to rape and murder them all if we captured them. That's why very few of them surrendered. They had them completely convinced that we were barbarians and that we were going to massacre all of them, right? So they were the good guys, we were the bad guys. In our mind, it was the exact opposite, right? So why does that happen? Why does that occur? Because if we know when it's going to occur or why it occurs, we might be able to do something about it, right? Ideally, we would never have to, or we'd find a way to prevent warfare, right? The fact of the matter is, as Plato said, only the dead have seen the end of war. So if we can't stop it, it behooves us as members of the Department of Defense to be able to predict when the next one's coming. Would you not agree? Yeah. All right, so let's talk about 2 things real quick. Does anyone know what the word pathological means? Okay, pathological is like a serial killer. Okay, so someone who really does not have a moral compass, they are predisposed to violence, they're deviant, right? They're deviant behaviors. They're your serial killers, your serial rapists, things like that, okay? Would you say that there's probably a small number of those people in the U.S. or a large number of those people in the U.S.?
A small number.
Relative, right? Deviant by nature means a relatively small number, right? Okay, so if it's a relatively small number and they're deviant, really we should, if all killing is deviant behavior, then these people that are like currently in traveling to Syria, right, to join ISIS, they're not serial killers, right? There's not 30,000, 60,000 serial killers floating around out there that all of a sudden decided to join ISIS, okay? So that's the pathological behavior. This model does not address pathological behavior. By definition, they're crazy, and you can't fix crazy. These are apathological, meaning without a pathology. So we and them and every human being has it within us, most of us anyway, to kill another human being, right? And still be psychologically normal. That's what this model addresses. Why do psychologically normal people willingly choose to engage in warfare with each other, okay? Now, these are a couple pictures here. This first one's from World War I. It's a group of Algerian soldiers that were massacred. And then to the right there is a guy, or used to be a guy, getting his head cut off by ISIS. Right? So these are behaviors that we do not think are normal, right? But in the course of warfare, all of a sudden they become normal, they become commonplace. So just, I mean, look at those pictures, it's pretty awful, right? The human body, when it's broken, is not pretty. All right, you might be asking yourself, what's in it for you to sit here and go through this brief? Well, let me ask you this question. If you're in a situation where you need to quickly decide if violent conflict is going to occur, right, for your own safety, now let me add on to that the safety of your fellow soldiers, your friends, and your family. And if you guess wrong, your family's going to die, get wiped out, get massacred. Wouldn't it be a good idea to have a systematic way of trying to predict that violent outcome might occur? Right? So we've seen 9/11. We'll talk a little bit more about 9/11 later on. I know some of you weren't alive when that occurred, but some of you were. And then over on the other side there is a Jewish family being massacred by a Nazi soldier. Okay? So these are things that actually do happen. The world is not a pretty place. Here in America, we've been fortunate that we haven't had very many attacks, but they still occur. All right. So if you can't stop the next war, you should at least know where it's coming from. So let's talk about false negatives, false positives real quick. Okay. So predictive intelligence, you have a false positive, which means you think something's going to happen and it doesn't. Right? Okay. So what's the worst case scenario for a false positive? Well, the worst case scenario is you spend a bunch of money on security, let's just say, and nothing happens. I don't like wasting money. All right. A false negative is where you don't think anything's going to happen and something actually occurs. At your Pearl Harbor, your 9/11, the recent shooting in San Bernardino, right? These are things that we didn't think anything was going to happen, and lo and behold, something happens. All right. Well, what's the negative consequences to a false negative?
Casualties.
I mean, we're talking pretty major potential negative consequences, right? You look at during World War II, how many countries were completely overrun by the Nazis because they were convinced that they're not coming here, right? And then they wake up and your whole country is now owned by the Nazis because they assaulted you in the middle of the night. So false negatives are the big thing that we want to try to avoid at all costs. Same token, a false positive, you just end up burning up all your money and your time. We can't chase everything, right? So we have to have some sort of systematic way of trying to eliminate those false positives and false negatives. But the false negative is the big one. All right, so part of the problem with predicting warfare is that existing theories on warfare don't actually explain enough of the phenomenon. All right, so we have things like what's called anarchistic self-help. It's a theory about warfare. Okay, and what that theory says is every country is looking out for number one. The actual global environment, right, is anarchy. Like, there's nobody in charge. In theory, the UN is. We all know no one listens to the UN. So, but there's no kingdom of the world. Right? There's no king of the world. There's no arbitrator that every country agrees is in charge of them. So it's an anarchy. So each country is not really fighting, but competing against the other countries in the world, right, for money, resources, whatever. And that's a theory on warfare. Okay. That particular theory, there's some other ones too. Man is inherently violent, so therefore we're always going to fight. You know, that's kind of given up, but all right. Some people focus on the legalities, civilizational clash, right? Hey, the Muslims stop here, Christian society stops here. Well, those two cultures meet is where all the war is going to happen. Some people actually predicted that would be the future of warfare. Mass movements, right? So like Hitler was a mass movement in the sense that people kind of rose up, followed him blindly. So a lot of these theories, the majority of these theories actually require what's called rational actors. Okay, so anyone here play chess? One? Everyone know the basic rules of chess? Okay, so you know that if you sacrifice your pawn, right, to take a higher ranking piece, that's a good strategy. If you lose your higher ranking piece for a pawn, bad strategy. The whole game of chess is based on the idea of a rational actors theory. You're going to rationally be able to deter somebody, engage somebody, whatever, based on logical movements, right? That's the idea of strategy. Problem with the rational actors theory, it doesn't really hold water, right, in enough situations to be a good theory, okay? So we got up here the theory of gravity, right? And that's Newton's little theory of gravity. You got a little mathematic thing up on the board here. That theory, okay, is created the same way that some of these conflict theories have been created. And that's where you have an observed behavior, right, or observed thing, whatever it is. Sky's blue, apple fell out of a tree, these guys are fighting a war against each other. And then you develop some sort of explanation for why that is occurring, right? Then you have a theory. And then you go and you test your theory because you say, well, if this, then this means this, then the next time that this and this happen, right, what do we expect? The same thing to happen over again, right? But existing conflict theories are so limited, they don't address everything. So you can't use them successfully to predict, right? We didn't predict 9/11. We didn't predict the Bosnian War. We predicted the Iraq War because we were the ones that kicked it off. We did not predict the insurgency, right? We definitely didn't predict ISIS. So these things are occurring based on these models that are outdated, that we're not using correctly. They're not actually a good theory, okay? So that's why I developed my own. All right, so we have two theories that we're going to put together, or two theories that we're going to put together and try to create a unified theory, okay? In psychology and sociology, there are two theories, all right? I combined and broadened them during my research over the last 4 or 5 years. All right, the two theories are called the victim identity and social categorization theory, all right? And what the victim identity basically states is that when I am victimized, and we'll get into more detail in a little bit, but when I am victimized, I am therefore justified to retaliate, right? I'm sure all your parents probably told you that when you were growing up in school, right? Don't be the one to throw the first punch, but if someone punches you, you can fight back, right? So if I'm victimized, all bets are off. I can retaliate, I can do whatever I want. The social categorization theory, what that talks about is humans are social animals by nature. We always want to be in groups, right? So how and why we group is actually studied by psychologists and sociologists. All right, there's different ways, we'll get into them in a little bit, what those groupings are, but just know that the idea, the concept of grouping and the concept of victimization, when you put them together, is what causes violent conflict. All right, so the victim identity model is, let me back up. All right, so when you talk about existing intelligence, predictive intelligence, right? Those theories I just told you guys about, they're what they call qualitative, meaning when you read a book and you enjoy it, right? That's a qualitative understanding of that book. Like, hey, this is a good book. Hey, I now know a lot about diving that I didn't know about before, right? Quantitative is where you're dealing with numbers, okay? Quantitative makes the theory much easier to use, because if it says, hey, if I got $1 and something 75 cents, how much am I going to get back? 25 cents, right? Guess what? Every time I have $1 and something costs 75 cents, I'm going to get 25 cents back. So I can quantitatively measure what something is, okay? So that's, the victim identity model is quantitative in nature. And what the victim identity model basically says is, at some point along an axis, we'll call it a y-axis for now, there is a tipping point where when these two social categorization things and that victim thing we talked about a second ago, when they reach the tipping point, is game on. We have warfare. We have violent conflict as a group, okay? So we don't exactly know where that tipping point is yet, but this line here is a good example of quantitative theory in action, right? So we measure stuff. We get ourselves a line, and we have this highlighted line here that says, hey, at this point, if we go above that line, we're going to have some sort of violent conflict between these two groups. Okay, so that's really what this theory kind of comes out and ultimately says. Once you have that tipping point, right, where you feel like your group, whatever that group happens to be, that you have a good group identity and that you've been victimized, right, so now you're acting in self-defense, is when you have that non-pathological violent response, right? Because with us, we're good. The they is bad, right? We're all in this room divers, right? What kind of divers are we? We're Army divers, right? So we automatically think we're better than the Navy divers across the hallway. Just by nature, right? It's called Freud's narcissism of minor differences. Go to the same school, get the same training, but you wear a little bit different uniform, we're automatically better. Yeah, we are better, but I'm just, the point is that every group has a difference with another group. And that narcissism of minor differences says that we will always think that our group is a little bit better than their group. All right, so a theory on collective group violence is only as good as its ability to measure all forms of the phenomenon. Imagine if Isaac Newton's theory of gravitation only worked 80% of the time. Would we still rely on it, right? Even though Einstein's theory of gravity, right? Drop an apple from a tree, right? It'll fall at a certain rate. So, and that's what's over there on the right-hand side. There's the actual mathematical equation. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that only worked 8 out of 10 times. From a purely scientific standpoint, how good of a theory is that for you guys? I mean, if your weapon only went off 8 out of 10 times, we don't really know why. You just eject that round and try again. It's not a very reliable weapon, right? Not a very reliable theory. So we need to come up with a better theory that better addresses what's actually occurring. Okay? Now I'll tell you kind of a funny story. It's called the real famous study that was done in criminology, and the researchers determined that every time ice cream sales went up in the city of Chicago, violent crime went up. They measured it for years and years and years and years and years. So they led to the determination, they published it in an article, a magazine, the whole nine, that increased ice cream sales must therefore cause increases in crime. Right, does anyone believe that that is a true statement? That if we just ban ice cream in the city of Chicago, everyone will stop committing crimes?
No.
So what do we think happened?
I read somewhere it increased like heat and temperature causes people to become more agitated and increase crime.
You nailed it. The increase in, not only does it make people more agitated, but the increase in temperature causes people to what? Not stay home. If it's negative 30 degrees out, no one's out wandering the streets, right? But when it's warm out in the summertime, people want to go out, they want to walk around, they want to be outside, they want to eat ice cream, and then therefore you have more opportunities to commit crimes, right? So that's called a hidden causal variable. That's that little Z up there. So just because X and Y are occurring at the same time does not necessarily mean that they're related. So if you can't use your theory that you developed 100% of the time, odds are there's some hidden variable that you're not able to measure or you're not thinking about, right? For example, decompression tables for diving. Are they 100% guaranteed that you're not going to get DCS if you dive them? Nope. Because there's some hidden variable, or actually in this case, a lot of hidden variables, that we don't understand enough to be able to measure. So we just give you an extra $150 a month and hope for the best. Experimental dive pay. That's why you guys get experimental dive pay. All right. The reason that these theories the reason that the existing conflict theories don't work 100% of the time is that there's a hidden causal variable that exists that has not been studied. And that is victimization by proxy. Meaning, you can experience all of the exact same victimization and response to victimization without actually having been victimized. All right? And that's what we're going to get into here in a little bit. Or you can call it a vicarious victim, meaning you can live vicariously through somebody, or you can be victimized vicariously through somebody else. In my theory, I call it the macro victim. So the micro victim is the person that actually is victimized, right? So if I walked over to Specialist Michael and punch him in the face, he's my micro victim, right? But if it offends you, because you guys are all on the same team in the same class, right? You can experience a lot of this, other than the pain in his face, a lot of the same emotional and response to retaliation that he would, even though you never actually got punched in the face. All right, so who was alive and remembers actual attack on 9/11? Okay, so where were you on 9/11?
I was in my, first grade classroom, and then we got sent home by the family. Okay.
Do you remember how you feel, or you just remember the day?
I didn't see my dad for a couple of days, so.
Okay, so that was probably a lot of, you were concerned, or,
Yeah.
yeah. Was anyone a little older? Like, well, I know all the old folks in the back were
I'm
older.
not that old. I'm 27. I was in 7th
I
grade.
was in 4th grade, and I was at school, and they wanted to tell us what happened, and I was riding in the truck with my dad to go somewhere, and I remember him saying that, and it's kind of like an awful moment, because everything seemed fine and dandy in my little world.
Mhm.
Like, seems like the 90s and 2000s were gonna be great and nothing major is gonna happen. Like World War II is past, and all the major conflicts were over, and now it's
Right, and in an instant, right, all that
Yeah.
goes away. For those of you that were old enough, does anyone remember that sensation that it was game on, and that if you had a gun and you were in the military, that you were ready to rock and roll? I know the two in the back, older, they were in their 20s, or in case of Sergeant Boogie, he was in his 50s. I was also in my 20s, early 20s when 9/11 happened, and that's the sensation that I remember. Have any of you guys watched? Can't remember his name. Vogel, I believe it is, the former U.S. Army Ranger who was beheaded by ISIS about a year and a half ago. I didn't really get out more, watch the news. Those types of videos, right? Not that you should spend all your time watching them, but they invoke that same emotional response, right? Has anybody in this room right now been motivated to defend somebody or yourself or your country, etc., based on something that you saw but didn't really affect you? Right? I mean, everybody kind of tracking what I'm saying? So when you see on TV, some folks, some U.S. service members, special forces, whatever, getting attacked and killed by ISIS, you're like, put me in, coach, right? That's that phenomenon that I'm talking about. In reality, if you think about it from just a purely scientific standpoint, only, or 0.0009% of people were directly affected by 9/11 in this country. Country of 380 million people, less than 3,000 died, right? That is a super, super small percentage. So if we look at it as purely logical people, right, rational actors theory, if we looked at it purely by the numbers, we'd all be like, not really worth it, right? Things happen. If those buildings had fell during an earthquake instead of an attack on 9/11 by Islamic terrorists, would you even still be talking about it 10, 15 years later? No, because stuff happens, right? Act of God, man. Because it didn't, it wasn't an act of God, we, as a country, right, were victimized vicariously. And that's what I mean by that macro victimization. We, as a country, all felt the same sense of victimization as if we'd been standing there, even though we weren't actually there. All right, so let's talk real quick about existing conflict theories, and then we'll get into the new one. All right, existing conflict theories, which we talked about earlier, they must be discounted. They don't work. I don't know why we keep using them, but they're not working. All right, this is a real famous quote by Dr. Arendt. It says, "Power and violence are opposite. Where one rules, the other is absent. Violence appears where power is in jeopardy, but left to its own course, it ends in power's disappearance." What she's driving at, right, is if something has absolute power over you, there's no violent conflict, because you just accept that whoever it is in charge and you do whatever they say. As their level of power goes down, your desire to commit violence goes up. Okay, kind of makes sense within a certain part of the world. But what it doesn't do, it doesn't explain, and remember we talked about the anarchistic self-help? Well, in the anarchistic self-help world, according to her prediction, there would be nothing but violence. I mean, because no country has any power over anybody else, right? So we would be fighting all the time, but we're not. So obviously those existing theories only explain a little bit of why we have violent conflict. All right, so let's talk about the victim and victim identity, all right? Now, before you can really get into this, you got to think about it from the victim's perspective, right? From the other guy's perspective, or even from your perspective. But people's perception of reality is their reality. You cannot put somebody into your brain to experience the world the same way that you do. All you can do is try to develop empathy, understand where they're coming from, right? So, when you have a low internal, what's called locus of control, we're all pretty much type A personalities in this field. But there are other people, and I'm sure you all know who they are, or know of somebody who's not real self-confident, kind of has a lower self-esteem. They don't think that they control their life, right? So when bad things happen to those people, they generally tend to dwell on them. life's against me, right? Whatever the case might be, right? That's that victim identity that we're talking about. When you're consistently being victimized and you don't think that you can overcome or take back control of your destiny, you develop this mindset of the world's out to get me. Kind of the best one I'm driving at, right? You ever kind of see where I'm coming from? That is a psychological theory, meaning we're talking about doctor, guy on a couch, individual person. They develop this victim identity. The victim identity, especially in Western countries where we have this idea that we talked about earlier, the act of God, right? Well, if it's not an act of God, what do we immediately want to do? Who did it? Whose fault is it, right? Somebody's fault. This bad thing happened to me, it's somebody's fault. In some cases, maybe your own fault, but you're looking for the person responsible. If you start looking for the person responsible, you're doing that because you want to seek justice, right? You want to tip the scales, make it right. A persistent, the normal human reaction, but if you consistently do it, right, within your own mind, you consistently advocate your own responsibility for your life, you develop what's called a victim identity. Woe is me, everyone's out to get me. Whatever it is that I've done, I've only done out of self-defense or because the world is me a living. I mean, I think we all know people like that, right? It's a psychological phenomenon called the victim identity. Those people generally do not take responsibility for their own actions because they don't feel responsible for their own actions. All right? It's not like they're just making it up. They generally don't feel that way. At the individual level, it's a psychological problem. As we get into the other half of this thing called social categorization, you see where that individual psychological problem starts to grow and become an actual problem that leads to violent conflict. All right? What happens if this feeling actually occurs and you weren't even victimized? We talked about 9/11, right? Events currently going on in Iraq, Japan during World War II, Ferguson, Missouri, that was last year, you guys all remember that, right? Mm-hmm. People were coming from out of town that had never even met a Ferguson police officer to protest the Ferguson Police Department, right? So what that means is not that, again, it's not necessarily that they're wrong. What it means is that wherever they were sitting, they felt the exact same level of indignation and victimization as the people in Ferguson. So they were compelled to go and join that group, okay? That's that victimization by proxy. Does anybody have any other examples of victimization by proxy that you can think of? Pretty creative. No? Okay.
Muslims. Muslims.
I can't.
Muslims.
Muslims, yeah. I mean, that's definitely a group that can feel victimized even though nothing directly happened to them. I was going to use another good one, sports teams. Everyone watch football? Have a favorite team? Okay, your team does bad, you get mad about it? Mm-hmm. What bearing does it have on your life? 0%. And yet you're super happy when they win, and you're super bummed when they lose, right? For the most part, if you're an avid fan. Okay. So, now that we know how the victimization piece occurs, right? How do these groups get created? They don't just come out of nowhere, okay? That's called social categorization. They organize, all right? So what motivates them to organize? Social categorization teaches us that the individuals adhere to each other based on a shifting internal identity that draws us to each other based on our looks, clothing, geographic proximity, goal alignment, right? And we'll cover all these in detail later. But just remember, we're talking about a shifting identity. Okay, so think about it in terms of your own identity, and I'll use myself as an example. All right, I'm the son of a Marine. I lived in Japan for a while. I lived in California for a while. My stepdad's black. I lived in a real rundown part of California near LA. So these are all, so I can feel an attachment to the people of Japan because I lived there for 2 years, right? If Japan got nuked tomorrow, I would be personally very bummed about it. Even though I'm not Japanese, I have no Japanese in my blood, right? Those are the shifting identity movements. So I can feel super patriotic and American in one moment because something happened to our country, and in the next moment, I can be much more concerned about my family than my country, right? I identify myself with my family because something happened closer to home. So as these events occur, you start feeling yourself attached to different size groups, right? Right now, we're all Army divers, Therefore, the Navy's evil, and we pick on them all the time for being Navy divers. But guess what? If somebody kicked down the front gate of this base and started shooting, what would we all then be?
One team.
We'd all be military, right? And everybody like that would instantly stop this whole Army-Navy game weekend stuff and start fighting as one team. That's that shifting identity nature that I'm talking about, okay? So that's how we socially categorize ourselves. So these two things together led to the development of the victim identity model equation, right? We can actually quantify these numbers to determine what your score is and how likely you are to violently retaliate, all right? So let's talk about different pieces here, okay? So you have three things: the leadership, the strength of your identity, and the level of your victimization, okay? Obviously, if you have no leadership, it's very hard to create a group that's going to organize to do anything without leadership, right? If I hand you all one broom and say, go sweep the hallway, and none of you all are in charge, what are you going to do? Stand around and stare at the broom. Somebody at some point has to say, hey, I will start sweeping, or whatever, right? That's the leadership. The strength of your identity to that group determines how likely you are to join that cause. And the level of victimization of that group determines how likely you are to violently retaliate in self-defense. Right? Everybody tracking? Right. We score that along the y-axis, like I talked about earlier with that regression line. You look at every historical war and you score them, you will come at a number, whatever it is. That's the magical number that tells you, hey, above this number, these people are going to violently retaliate. It's going to happen. Right? That's that predictive intelligence piece that I was talking about. So let's break these three things down into their components, right? So we can see what the actual score would look like. Leadership, right? Pretty self-explanatory, right? We all know the difference between leadership and management, right? A little picture there, one of my favorites. Right? Leadership means you are literally leading them. There are only 3 jobs in the military that have the word leader in them. Do you guys know that? Fire team leader, squad leader, platoon leader. Those are the only 3 job titles in the military that have the word leader in them. They have those words because at those 3 levels, right, when we talk about combat, those are the 3 levels of leadership where that individual is saying, you 3 with me, we're going to kick that door down. Follow me. Literally follow me. I'm your team leader. Do what I do. Follow me and do what I do. Same thing with squad leader, right, and platoon leader. Past that level, we don't have generals leading charges anymore like we do in the Civil War. Right? Those people are managers. So you have to have a leader. You have to have somebody who can communicate to the masses that they're being victimized. Because if you don't even know that America is being victimized, in the case of 9/11, you have no response to that. It's not until somebody tells you that you've been victimized and you believe it that you go, all right. Right? So you got to have that leadership element. You also have to have your strength of identity, right? And this is A times B times C times D times E, and I'll briefly go over it. What this means is, based on these 5 variables, is how attracted you will be to that group, okay? So, for example, this is the easiest one, visibility of group identity. What are we all wearing right now? We're all wearing uniform. So I can walk into any military base, theoretically Army in this case, and if I see somebody in uniform, what do I automatically know right then and there? We're part of the same group, right? I can ask them directions. I can say hi, right? Reading of the day, salute them if they're an officer. I immediately know that they're on my team and what our roles are between each other, right? But we have something else on our uniform, right, called a rank. So those 2 pieces of information you can fit into any social setting within the military. It's almost like some really smart guy decided to put everybody in uniform. You know what I mean? Like, that's why we do it. It's that exact reason. It's to create that increase in social identity. All right? And then we have the geographical proximity. Do you feel more or less attached to the people that live in the neighborhood where you grew up? More, right? More than you do probably the people in the Middle East. The farther you get in a geographical proximity, the harder it is to maintain a group identity. All right, then we have goal alignment, okay? The more narrow unified goals, more like tactical goals, the more narrow you can define your group goals, that increases group identity, right? If you have this, use Greenpeace as an example, like their goal is, I don't even know, they're obviously environmental people, but they don't really actually have a good goal. Hey, our goal is to reduce pollution by 10%, 20%, whatever. So it's hard to be attached to that group for a lot of people, right? But if they define their goals, you're like, yep, I agree with that. I'm a part of that group. Then you have what's called a level of abstraction. Abstraction just means how our group is organized, right? Right now, our level of abstraction is U.S. Army deep sea divers. At this moment, that's what our group, okay? As we think wider, we have the Department of the Army in general, right? Then we have the military, then we have the Department of Defense, then you have the government, right? Then you have U.S. citizens. As you think bigger or more and more abstract, you have less and less attachment to that group. See what I'm saying? We all about being Army divers. We're okay about being in the Army. We're pretty ambivalent about being in the Department of Defense. As you get farther, eventually you can go all the way to human. Like, how much attachment do you have to every member of the human race? Right? All right, who's seen the movie Independence Day? All right, aliens invade today. How much attachment do you have to the human race? A whole lot, right? That's my point. The level of abstraction at the human level right now is as big as we can go. Insert another race, and we instantly feel more attached to being human than we did 5 seconds ago. And the level of accentuation. Accentuation means that we are 100% alike, or that's like the highest level. We are 100% alike, we're exactly the same, we all look and talk and everything the same, and nobody else is like us. All the way to our group has a lot of in common with other groups, right? So think Republican and Democrat is a good example for this one, right? A Republican and Democrats, 100% different. I mean, not really, right? I mean, they have different political parties, but neither party wants to murder the other, right? Neither of them believe in murder. They both believe that the U.S. is the greatest country in the world, for the most part. So they have a lot of commonality, right? That's why they sit in Congress and they work stuff out. So your strength of identity to the Republican versus the Democratic Party is softened because we know that we do have a lot in common. I don't have to hate the other party because there's a lot of stuff we can talk about. Everybody see where I'm going with that? Mm-hmm. And that's that accentuation piece. And a little picture there. Everything's perspective, right? So the Middle Eastern woman thinks that it's very inappropriate that the other gal's eyes are blocked, right? Because that's the most important part to that culture. And then the Western gal thinks it's crazy that this Middle Eastern gal has to get all dressed up and cover everything but her eyes, right? So it's just different perspectives. The next variable is the level of macro victimization, all right? And this is the other piece of this pie. So we have our proximity to victimization, okay? So that's what we talk about. If you're the primary source versus the secondary source. If you were personally victimized by another group, you are a primary source of victimization. The farther away you get from that, the lower the score becomes, right? So if you heard about a guy that 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 was attacked by ISIS, that's not gonna ratchet it up for you. If your brother was attacked by ISIS, now all of a sudden that level of victimization goes way up, right? The second variable is the severity of victimization. If you're just throwing Coke bottles or making fun of each other, not that big of a deal, right? The more severe it gets, the higher it ratchets up that level of victimization. So if I believe in my heart that this other group poses an existential threat to my group, that victimization score is going to go through the roof, okay? And then the last one is immediacy of threat. And that's pretty common, right? Or pretty obvious, rather. We're lazy. Humans are procrastinators by nature. And people still have Christmas shopping left to do. A couple of them, me too. We don't like wait till the last minute, okay? So if that threat isn't immediate, it tends to temper our victimization level, right? So ISIS is an example. We know about it. ISIS kind of gets torqued up a little bit. But if there were 30,000 ISIS terrorists here, it'd be a little different ball of wax, right? All right, so let's look at some samples real quick. So we talk, first thing, you got fellow Christians that were killed in the Middle East. Assuming you're Christian, right? When you see another Christian get killed in the Middle East, your score is going to be pretty low, right? Because they're not very close to you. They don't look like you, right? Things of that nature. Why do you think? Well, I don't know. One of the reasons why we think that Muslims adhere to each other a little bit better than other religions is because they have a uniform. You know, radical Muslims grow the beard, right? They have ways of visually identifying each other. So that brings up their group cohesion a little bit. So if you have fellow Muslims being killed in the Middle East, right now our score goes up a little bit higher, a little bit more likely that we're going to identify with that group and want to go over to Syria, right, and join in the cause. And then we got, now we'll jump all the way down to these last two here. Okay, small military unit attacked by the enemy. There's a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Grossman, wrote a book called On Killing. Great book, I highly recommend you read it. I believe it's in the library, you guys can check out. He measured the firing rates of all U.S. military from the Civil War all the way to World War II. And what he found a lot of interesting things. But one of the interesting things that he found was the highest firing rates. Everyone knows what a firing rate is, right? The highest killing rates in U.S. military was from small elite units that had recently suffered one of their own as killed or made a casualty. Almost 100% of the people in that situation, soldiers, Marines, whatever, were more than willing to take their gun, aim at the enemy, and kill them. You know what the firing rate is for just regular troops? Now it's higher because we've developed techniques to brainwash you guys better. But I'm not joking. But back in the day, it was right around 60%. So 6 out of 10 were willing to fire. And most of them, a lot of them, would admit later on when they were interviewed by Lieutenant Colonel Grossman and General Marshall, the other guy doing the study, that they were purposely aiming over the other guy's head. We were not very effective as a war machine. But again, those small elite units that were attacked, that had one of their own suffer almost 100% instantaneously. So you see how our numbers start to climb, right? Really, really high. And then this last one, okay, if you have an armed invasion of your home, one family member has already been wounded, been shot, right? Can you get any bigger than that? Can you think of anybody that you know that would not be willing and able to fire at that intruder in that situation? Right? Because that's off the chart. You and your family's survival is at stake. There's an existential threat. You feel closer to your family than probably anybody else in the world. Right? That's the highest we can ratchet those numbers up. So you see where we start with, 1 or 2 people may join the cause. Not really like the whole country's going to get behind the poor Christians being killed in the Middle East, right? Then the Muslims, it's a little bit closer, but still kind of low, onesie twosies. And as you ratchet it up to, 100% almost of the people in the world that would be willing to violently retaliate. So that's the victim identity model. That's how the math kind of shakes itself out. Okay? So what does that mean? What are the implications for the United States? Existing predictive intelligence uses qualitative means, experience in the region, knowledge of the key players, all these existing conflict theories, etc. However, the link between macro victimization and violent retaliation is direct and it's highly correlated, meaning we can directly measure those two together and see that they're almost going in step and step and step. Additionally, the victim identity model is culturally universal, right? So, we talked about the rational actors theory earlier. Well, what if you're from a different culture and your version of rational is different than ours? You're going to do things differently, right? So we can't predict as well what you're going to do. The victim identity model is culturally universal. If I break into a Japanese person's house and kill one of their family members, they will be equally as likely to violently retaliate against me as if I did it here in America. The victim identity model can be used, therefore, to predict violence, right? Because we can measure it, we can look at it, we can score it, we can scale it, put it up on the board next to other situations that have scored the same number, and tell you pretty accurately what's going to happen. All right. Now, the next step, how do we prevent it? Right, that's really the next segment, because the people in this room right now, we are the ones that stand to suffer the most. You have put on a uniform, you swore to defend the Constitution of the United States of America. You're the one that's going to be going into harm's way. Right? And like I said before, these pictures should disturb you. They are disturbing pictures. War is not pretty. It sucks. So if we are the ones that have to suffer, then doesn't it make sense that we be the ones to look at how we can diffuse the situation? We now know that there are 3 variables that determine group violence. You can see them, you can measure them. The next step is, how do we reduce them? That's undoing the cycle of victimization. Because if you talk to somebody in the Middle East, America's the devil, right? People in Palestine and all over the Middle East cheered when 9/11 happened. We finally got ours, right? Same token, we cheered when we killed bin Laden. And they were all upset about that. At some point, this thing has to stop, right? So you got 2 choices. You can just eradicate them, 100%. That's not very good, but let's just pretend that was an option, right? Total warfare, Long Clausewitz style. Level their cities, just keep killing them until they stop. Or you can try to undo that cycle. All right, this concludes my brief. Are there any questions? All right, gentlemen, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. I hope you learned a little something. And